Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. And this video, as you've already seen below in the title, is something along the lines of, how do you keep up? Do you want to keep up? There are too many board games. I don't know the exact title. I'm probably going to stick with how do you keep up. We'll see. And this is a topic that's been on my list for a while to cover. And today I had someone ask me, is it a problem that there are too many games going on? What is your opinion of the fact that we have too many games coming out? More and more games are coming out every single year. The space is growing in general. Is that sustainable? Is it a problem? What's the good, the bad, all of that? And I thought that's an excellent idea. That's an excellent topic idea. I'll do that. But first, let me get out of the way the conversation of how do you keep up, which is a sub-aspect of that conversation. So I'm clearing out this conversational piece. How do you keep up with all the new board games? What should you do? What tips, tricks, all of that. Ignore me. I'm playing a lot of the new games. We'll talk about that. And then at some point soon in the future, I'll go into that second topic of, in general, is it a good thing, is it a bad thing, and the larger ramifications of this conversation. But this one is a focused aspect of that conversation. If there are a lot of games, and you are pulled in by all these games, how do you keep up? And I'm going to go through it in 5 different ways, and 5 because usually I go with either 5, 7, or 10. 5 and 10 because they're the usual numbers, and 7 because it makes it sound like I had a specific number in mind, even though it just is a variation of 5, 7, or 10. So, video tips and tricks aside, let's go through this. And the first one is kind of an offshoot. It's less of an actual tip and more a starting point to the conversation. So really it's one question followed by 4 tips. There you go. Now I'm being original again. So first of all, to begin with, number 1 is, what is your goal? Start by defining that. This is something that I put out a video a long time ago, a video that I want to do again, of how to keep a lean board game collection. And it's a great video, in my opinion. It's a great topic. It's one that I want to revisit with, first of all, a better approach to the way I communicate to the camera, and a better way that I can enunciate and clarify the things I'm talking about without sounding as dry as I did back then. And secondly, with better audio and visual setup than I did back then. This is one of my first videos. This is my first video that did really well, I believe. Or my second video? I don't recall exactly. But either way, I want to revisit that video because I think it's an important topic. But before we even get into that topic, what is your goal? What is the aspect of this hobby, of board games, or perhaps not board games, perhaps whatever hobby it is that you want to apply this to, or anything you want to apply it to. But start by defining your goal. What is it that you want out of the space? So let's take board games as an example. Do you want to collect board games? Maybe the enjoyment you get out of the hobby is the pursuit of the acquisition, because there is enjoyment attached to that, and the idea of spending money to get enjoyment is a recognizable concept across the board. And so the question I would ask is, why does that enjoyment have to be localized to the playing of the board game? Maybe it's part of the process of researching the game, of buying the game, of having it show up at your doorstep. If it's Kickstarter, there's a full, longer process around that. That's why I have a video coming up at some point called Why Kickstarter is the Best Addiction, or something along those lines. There's an entire hobby or world of ways we can enjoy this hobby. There's what I'm doing right now, the fact that I'm talking about board games to you, the fact that you're watching this video. Those are all subsets of the enjoyment that comes with this hobby. It doesn't have to be localized to playing a game. Ask every single Warhammer collector ever. They spend most of their time building their armies and painting their armies, and less of their time playing their armies. Apologies to the 7 people who avidly play their Warhammer armies. I apologize. And 7 from who are watching this video, not 7 the worldwide. There's at least 15 worldwide. But in any case, my point is the context of enjoyment is one that you want to start by defining for yourself what it is you're looking for. We have these questions, these conversations. How do I keep playing the old games, and why do I keep playing the new ones? Who said you have to play the old games? For myself, I want to. But that goes back to defining your goals. What are your personal goals? What is it you're looking for out of this hobby? In terms of the concept of the question, why do you keep up, or how do I keep up? What is it you're trying to do? Define the problem, define the solution. Start with that. And so let's take an arbitrary potential problem. Let's assume the problem is there are too many new games. And either you have all these new games that are showing up in your feed, and your Facebook feed, and your wherever, and whatever YouTube content creators you are watching. Maybe you just see all these new games and you want to acquire them. And you either don't have the funds or think it's better not to spend the funds on acquiring those games. That might be problem number 1. Problem number 2 might be that you don't have a problem buying the games, but you don't have the time to play them, and your goal is to play them. In which case, that would be problem number 2. But again, start by defining what your personal goals are and move outwards from there. There may not be a problem here. Establish what it is you enjoy. Establish what it is you enjoy most about the hobby. That might be playing games, it might be playing old games, it might be exploring new games. Don't feel guilty about something if there's not a reason to feel guilty about it. That's more of a question and defining structure to the conversation. And really a defining structure to any of these conversations about how to keep a lean collection, how to stop backing games on Kickstarter, how to back more games on Kickstarter. These are all part of that conversation of defining for yourself what it is you want. Number 2, now that we've actually pretended for a second that you are trying to not get new games for one reason or another. You're trying to get fewer new games. You're trying to get less pulled in by it. So number 2 is going to be set a budget. And a budget does not necessarily mean a monetary budget. A budget could simply mean any sort of system. A budget could be any sort of system that limits what you are acquiring. That might be a monetary budget. Maybe you set that you can buy $100 worth of board games every single month. Maybe it's $50. Maybe it's $20. Maybe you have a pool that slowly builds up every single month. You could set a monetary budget. It could be a fixed number of games. You're allowed to get 2 new games per month. And again, that can be rolled over, whatever it is. Perhaps it's a 1-in, 1-out system. Every time you bring in a new game, you have to get rid of an old game. Maybe it's a Calyx Cube in or out. Every time you empty a Calyx Cube, you get rid of a Calyx Cube, you can load up a new Calyx Cube. The problem with 1-in, 1-out is I can get rid of Colorado and then get Oathsworn and the 3.5 Calyx Cubes of boxes it contains. So you choose the system, whatever it might be. 1-in, 1-out might well apply to that. But set yourself a limiting factor and you will already have some sort of system in place that allows you to get new games. So when you see that feed filling up, when you're watching the newest video of top 10 new games from 2020 and you're figuring out what you want to buy or what not, if you see too many things you want, you'll have to figure out how to limit yourself. And so a budget is a good idea in how to do that. It gives you the freedom to get stuff with the limitation of how much to get. I think it's a good idea. Again, it doesn't have to be monetary. It could be a count of board games. It could be 1-in, 1-out. It could be space-based. It could be playing it based. It could be whatever. It could be that you are not allowed to get new games if you have more than 5 unplayed games in your collection. Whatever that quote-unquote budget is, follow it. And it will be a very limiting factor while allowing you the freedom to still be very heavily in the acquisition part of this hobby. Number 3. I almost said number 2 because technically number 1 was just a framing of the conversation. I just cheated that way. Number 3 is going to be ask yourself when that game will be played. And more specifically, ask yourself when it'll be played and what you're substituting playing instead of it and what you'd rather be playing. So good example, and I frequently bring up Captain Soda. Let me think if I can bring up a different example for this. What's a game that I have recently... Let's see, Tricarion. Tricarion is a good example for me. So Tricarion is a game that I absolutely want to get. I've heard amazing things about it. But I have held off on acquiring Tricarion because I have 3 games from Lacerda sitting on my shelf. I have Lisboa, I have Escape Plan, and one other. I can't remember what it is called. It's blocked by my thing. Lisboa, Escape Plan, and the Art Gallery. Whatever the Art Gallery one is. But either way, I have 3 games from the Lacerda on my shelf. I have Anachrony from Mind Clash Games, and then I want to get Tricarion. And the reason I haven't, and the reason I shouldn't have gotten 2 of these Vitel Lacerda games, is for that aspect. I should have asked myself, when will it be played? And do I need to get that game now? And in the case of Tricarion, the answer is it'll be played in exactly the same set of circumstances in which I would play any of the other 4 heavy games I just mentioned. And so if I want to play a new game, forget even talking about the old games I have that I want to play, but if I want to play a newer game in that weight range, in that weight class, with that player count, I already have multiple viable options that will hit the table first. And so what's the rush on Tricarion? It doesn't mean I can't get it at some point. But there's no rush on getting Tricarion now because I know that as I look at that game, as I sit there at the shelf and I'm looking at the options on the table, as I look at Tricarion on the store shelf, whatever it is, there's no rush to get it. It's not like it's out of print forever. It's not like I can't get it at some point, either, new and shrink or secondhand market, whatever it is. Whatever new game is currently catching your interest, whatever thing, whether it's on Kickstarter. Kickstarter is a more complicated conversation because sometimes it's the best price, which is part of the nature of my content around the board anyway. But forget Kickstarter for a second. When you are looking at a game where there is no time-sensitive crunch of it's now or never, and now is the best possible chance to get it, Just ask yourself what you're playing that game instead of. What's the rush to get that game? And are you sure it's actually going to hit the table? Again, this assumes your goals are for the games to hit the table. Number 4, set a 1-year window. And I've talked about this before. The idea that you sit there and say, that game looks incredible, and let's talk about it again in a year. This is something I used to do. I don't do it anymore. It's a sacrifice of the nature of content creation. And I mean it when I say sacrifice. I'll explain that in a second. But it's something I've given up along with content creation, is the idea that I do not have to, but there's an incentive for me to cover the new things as much as possible. New games, both retail and Kickstarter, to get my hands on them as soon as possible to cover them, because that is where a good chunk of the eyeballs are. A good chunk of the viewers want to see things that are new. It's great that you put out coverage around Terraforming Mars, but I've watched coverage around Terraforming Mars for the past 3-4 years. I haven't seen coverage of Terraforming Mars Ares Expedition. That's a different conversation entirely. So covering new stuff is something I have to do now, but forget right now. Go back to, for myself, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, when the only things I got that were new were Kickstarter things that held their value. Everything else I got, I waited. I sat there and would sit there and say, again, I did this with Blood Rage, I did this with Terraforming Mars, I did this with Spirit Island, I did this with Gloomhaven. There were so many other games, great games, that I sat there and said, that looks incredible. I'm seeing it show up on all my Facebook feeds. It looks amazing. Let's see if they're talking about it in a year. Do you know the amount of games that show up on your Facebook feed that stop showing up in your Facebook feed a year later? That no one else is talking about it? Think about it. Think about all those games that showed up. Think about the games that showed up half a year ago. Suddenly these games, they show up, people get them, they're excited, the new copy of this, of Mariposas, of Pendulum, of Dwellings of Eldervale, they all show up on your feed and people are excited. Which ones are they still excited about 6 months down the road? Which ones do you still see people talking about a year down the road? And some of those they might still be talking about. Dwellings of Eldervale may still be an evergreen game a year from now. But it also might not be. And Mariposas and Pendulum, they don't get talked about that much, or at least Pendulum gets talked about a little more negatively. Mariposas is a little bit more neutral. Lots of games come and go in the board game space. It's the nature of the fact that we have so many games coming in. The very problem that prompts you to ask the question means that many of these games aren't sticking around. And so for myself, I used to have a pretty firm rule that I just didn't bother touching things that were new. I let the market, I let other people filter the games for me. I sat there and said, it's great, I do want everything, I'll get everything, if I still want to a year from now. It's amazing what excitement, or the lack of excitement, can do for us. Seeing people be hyped about a game, seeing people play a game, it draws us in. We want to be part of that conversation, but that also means we can be part of the liquidation that occurs as slowly but surely over time people realize game X was fun, it was fine, it was good, it just wasn't great. It wasn't a game that we needed to own. It was an experience that we wanted to enjoy. This is something we see in movies as well. This is something we see in any culture. I mean, think about movies. Think about all the trailers you see for a movie and how you're like, I want to watch that trailer. And some of them are movies that come out and people talk about and they're excited for. And others you kind of never hear anything about. And then 4 years down the road, you're like, wasn't there that trailer for that movie? Did anyone ever watch it or whatnot? You could have been one of the people lining up in the theater to try to pay $20 to go see that movie. Or you could sit at home and just wait and see how it goes, and half the time it's just not worth watching. Any aspect of medium, whether it's gaming, whether it's books, whether it's movies, whether it's music, whether it's board games, anytime there's going to be an influx of too much, inherently over time, the good will float to the top. People will still talk about the good. People still talk about the movie Knives Out. They don't talk about a lot of other movies because most movies these days are just not that great. And the same thing happens with board games. So give yourself a year. Set a 1-year window, and if you really can't do it, set a 6-month window. Heck, give yourself a 3-month video if you can't do anything. Any of these time frames will buy you time to let that initial surge of excitement around a new title to slowly but surely filter away. And this will be true for myself as well, by the way. When I talk about a game, when I review a game and I'm like, that was a good game, I'm so happy it's in my collection, sometimes 6 months from now, it'll be going away. There is a cult of the new at play. There are games that I don't think will go away at 6 months, and I talk about longevity in my reviews for a reason. But there are games that are good, and there are games that are great. And time is usually what will be the telling factor there. Before we go on to the reason number 5, just in terms of sacrifice, what I mean by sacrifice is when you sit there and you do subject yourself to playing all the new stuff, and effectively being part of the market that tests whether something is worth keeping or not, you're inherently giving up your time to play mediocre games sometimes. And mediocre is a harsh word. Really what I mean is good games, but there are so many good games, and I'd rather play only the great games. If you give yourself that time, if you give yourself that year, over time you will find that you end up on average playing better games. If you jump into the market feet first, if you are part of the people testing the market, then you're giving up time to play games that aren't as good as the ones you could otherwise be playing. Which brings me to reason number 5. Not reason, tip number 5. Tip number 5 is a hard one, and I doubt many of you will listen the same way I'm not listening. But get off of Kickstarter. I mean it. Get off of Kickstarter. Take a look at your Kickstarter purchases for the past year. And I'll give the counter to this when we're done. Don't worry, I'm not completely crazy. Take a look at your Kickstarter purchases for the past year. See what is still exciting to you. See which ones you're still happy you backed. Better yet, take a look at the Kickstarter purchases that have arrived in your collection. Take a look at however many, maybe I don't know how long you've been backing Kickstarter games, but maybe 10 Kickstarters have arrived. Tell me how many of them are wins for you. How many of them are games you are so excited, so thrilled about, and how many of them are not. How many are games that you didn't really need, that are okay at best, that maybe lost their value or lost their luster or their allure, that just weren't the game you thought it was when you backed it. Kickstarter is an expensive place to be. And it's one that pulls us in with FOMO, and we're all victim to it. I mean, I talked about this recently, but Castle of Mad King Ludwig, a game that I chose not to own, a game I said I'm not interested in it, but they threw it up on Kickstarter with a deluxe version for like $100 plus, whatever it is, and I'm like, ooh, maybe I should get back Castle of Mad King Ludwig. There's this shine of Kickstarter. There's an addiction behind it. This is something I will talk about when I talk about why Kickstarter is the best addiction. It is not a meaningless fluff title. I genuinely believe the way Kickstarter operates is just firing all the dopamine centers off in our brain, treating us with updates and appeals and things that pull us in and make us want to jump in on the game. There's a real addiction behind Kickstarter, and it makes us look at games that we otherwise wouldn't have paid attention to. And we pay a lot of money for those games. And some of those games are the best games you will have. Others are not. And so take a look at your own spending habits on Kickstarter. See whether you, in hindsight, regret the purchases you've been making. And if you have, if you don't feel it's really been giving you the best of the best, especially in terms of the amount of money you're spending on it. Again, look at all the Kickstarters that have delivered for you. Take a look at how much money you've spent. Take a look at what you've gotten out of it. And a big factor as well is, are you selling or trading away those ones that didn't work for you? Are you getting back your money? Ask yourself what you've lost. Your loss being defined as what you've spent versus minus what you were able to get back. And then ask yourself whether the remaining game experiences were worth that. And if the answer is no, then get off Kickstarter. Now the flip side to that argument, and where I'm still on Kickstarter, and where many of you should arguably still be on Kickstarter, is if you try to limit your backing, or if you back games that hold their value. If you can sit there and say, no, I have spent $2,000 in Kickstarter the past year, but I got back $1,800, and the remaining $200 is because I have games X, Y, and Z that are totally worth $200. They are some of my best gaming experiences, whatever. If you can say that with confidence, then by all means, stay on Kickstarter. But if you're having problems keeping up with board games, get off Kickstarter. If you're having problems getting too many games, and you don't know when you're finding time to play them, get off Kickstarter. At the end of the day, ask yourself how long you've been in the hobby. Ask yourself whether you really feel those years not on Kickstarter were a major loss for you. Take myself. I've been in the hobby since 2012. I've been a Kickstarter addict since 2018 maybe 2017 at best. I don't feel my first 5 years were lacking. I don't feel I missed out on much, if at all, although I do want those Dogs of War's little plastic soldiers. Those I missed out on. But for the most part, I don't feel I really missed out on anything by not being a Kickstarter junkie from 2012 to 2018. And for the most part, I'm betting that most of you probably feel the same way. It is a fresh, new experience. It's something that's fun. I enjoy the process. But as long as you can keep up with the games, it's fine. If you're spending too much money on games, or if you just don't have time to play them, and you're looking for tips on how to not, then get off Kickstarter. That's basically it. Once again, first of all, define your actual goals. Define what it is you actually care about. Is this an actual problem that you are facing, or just a problem you've decided that you have and haven't really thought through? Number 2, set a budget, whatever that system is. Whatever that system might be, one in, one out, monetary based, Calyx Q based, whatever it is. Number 3, ask yourself when that game will be played, and is it worth playing that game over whatever else is going to be played instead? Do you really need that game? Is it better than the other unplayed games or played games that you have in your collection that you would play given the same time constraints, weight class, player count, all of that? Number 4, set yourself a 1-year window. Give yourself time to see whether games are or are not good. And number 5, get off Kickstarter, because unless you really need to be on there, it's probably just costing you a lot of money and a lot of time and giving you an okay value. Until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, have a good one.